discussion, and we'll proceed from there. All right. So let me begin here with the first session, which covers David Livingstone's early life, introduction, early life, and inland African travels. Let's pray and then we'll begin. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day and the life of a remarkable man used by you in a great way to bring the gospel to Africa in many ways. Because of his foundational work, we are able to gather, and we are gathered this morning and this day to study his life. Would you be pleased to use this study to awaken us, to encourage us, to rebuke us as we seek to be your servants, laboring for you in your vineyard. We ask that you might bless us in this time for Jesus' sake. Amen. All right, so the booklet has a timeline and a couple of maps and a couple of pictures. I might need that map at some point. All right, so introduction. For many people, especially with how busy we are today, and life is very busy, I also feel it's busy, to spend an entire day studying the life of someone feels a little bit like a waste of time. To be honest, I also felt that it would be too much to spend the whole day looking at his life. My preference would probably just to do it in a morning session alone. But I deliberately made your lives difficult and mine by making it a whole day seminar, because I wanted to help us develop, especially those of us here at Hillview Baptist Church, the discipline of learning. And, the church needs, as the most important thing, your time commitment. Above your money, above your energy, your time commitment to be able to learn. And so that's really the idea here. I think it's important to commit a whole day to this study because the New Testament does encourage us to study heroes. In Hebrews 11, we have a list of heroes of the faith, or a phrase I learned from Mr. Chama, the whole of faith, not the whole of fame, the whole of faith. At Kabwata Baptist Church, the church that planted us here at Hillview Baptist Church, we used to have these studies 2 or 3 times a year of seminars, all-day seminars. One was dedicated to biographies, and it was actually called the Heroes of the Faith Day. And what we're doing this day is basically a copy of what was happening there. In Hebrews chapter 11, several people are highlighted for their remarkable faith in God. Abel, Cain, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses' parents, Moses himself, and Rahab. And after taking 30 verses to highlight the lives of these people and their remarkable faith, he goes on to say the following in verse 32, Hebrews 11 verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flocking, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. Can you imagine? This is in the Bible. They went about, these words, they went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. The numbers of such heroes of the faith are only increased after the Bible. After the Bible, we have so many outstanding men and women who went through many of the things that this verse describes. Great sacrifices and great demonstrations of faith in service to God. We need to know those stories, and we need to tell those stories. The reason why is given in the first two verses of the following chapter, Hebrews 12 verse 1. After listing out all these great heroes of the faith, the writer of Hebrews says, Hebrews 12 verse 1, therefore, in conclusion, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So knowing these stories helps us to see that we have a responsibility, that these people who have gone before us from Bible times, even after the Bible, are actually watching. That's what it calls them, a cloud of witnesses. So they're not just having margaritas in heaven with Jesus. They're actually watching keenly and with great interest to see how are those who are coming behind us faring. And we have a responsibility to carry on from where they left off. And knowing these stories helps us see that the excuses we make and the challenges we face are no reason for us not to do what Hebrews 12 says, run the race with endurance. So then, let us consider the great missionary, explorer, and abolitionist, David Livingstone. So why study Livingstone's life in particular? Southern Africans, those who are in Southern Africa, have more reason than anyone to be well acquainted with the life of David Livingstone. Africa was only known in the lifetime of David Livingstone in its coastal regions, so the areas around the coast. The interior was unknown. In fact, the assumption was that it was nothing more than desert. It was empty. No one could survive there. There was nothing remarkable, interesting happening there. They didn't think there were any people there. And so it was aptly named the Dark Continent. Even if you found a map in those days, it would be empty in the middle of Africa because they didn't even know what was there and no one had bothered to map it out. Some say the Portuguese had some maps which might be true, but they were inaccurate and speculative. For the sake of the gospel, David Livingstone ventured into the African interior to bring the gospel to the tribes that were there. For many tribes, he was the only white man they had ever seen. And he was the first to bring the gospel to them. He brought the gospel to modern-day interior Congo, Angola, Zambia, Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. All those countries in the interior of them. He made people aware, and he made the world aware of the geography of the interior of those areas. He made people aware of the tribes that existed there and how the best routes that the interior could be accessed. If you live in these countries today and you know the gospel, you owe it in large part to the foundational work that David Livingstone did. He himself, David Livingstone, desired that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. These are his words. Like reformers before the Reformation, quoting David Livingstone, future missionaries will see conversions follow every sermon. We prepare the way for them. May they not forget the pioneers who worked in the thick gloom with few cheering rays to cheer except such as flow from faith in God's promises. We work for a glorious future which we are not destined to see. The golden age which has not been but will yet be. We are only morning stars shining in the dark, but the glorious morn will break, the good time coming yet. 10 months after his death, the slave trade that really affected David Livingstone to see how Africans were being mistreated, chained, enslaved. 10 months after his death, he worked to end it. He failed in his lifetime, but within 10 months of dying, the Eastern Arab African slave trade was ended, was stopped. And it's all because of him. The deaths of millions of Africans ended. 30 years after his death, the once dark continent of Africa was shared among 7 European countries at the Berlin Conference. And this helped. The negative thing is it led to colonization, but the positive thing is that it stopped the savagery that was happening in Africa, where tribes were killing each other and, destroying each other, because these European countries came into Africa and shared Africa out. They brought sanity and order and civilization into Africa. That was 30 years after he died. And by the way, that's what he wanted. He knew the only way we'll stop these Africans from sorting each other out, who are primitive in their thinking, in their actions, is by Europeans coming in and bringing in civilization. 50 years after he died, the railroads reached the interior of Africa from Cape Town, South Africa. Thus, the once dark and uncharted interior of Africa had commerce and trade, exactly what David Livingstone was praying for. Livingstone is perhaps the most celebrated white man in Africa from his day. Most statues have been brought down. Most names that were given after colonialists have been changed. But places named by and for or after David Livingstone remain largely intact. In 1955, 100 years after Livingstone discovered and named the falls, his grandson, Dr. Hubert Wilson, went to Victoria Falls and unveiled a commemorative tablet in honor of David Livingstone's discovery. And in case you think it was just the white people who were commemorating and honoring Livingstone. That is not so. 100 years after his death in 1874, that was now 1974, 8 years after Zambia's independence, 1,000 people, led by the first president, Kenneth Kaunda, gathered at Chitambo village to celebrate or honor his life by unveiling a plaque and a memorial to David Livingstone at the site near his death. The president said at that event, what dominated Livingstone's life, this is Kenneth Kaunda in 1974, what dominated Livingstone's life was his sense of mission as a servant of the people of Africa. He did not see himself as a leader in any sense at all. By the way, at that commemorative event, 2 of David Livingstone's great-granddaughters were flown in to participate. President Kaunda said that Dr. Livingstone's exploration was aimed at opening up the interior of Africa to commerce by finding river waterways that would carry traders there. It was his hope, David Livingstone's hope, that general commerce in East, West, and Central Africa would replace the slave trade, against which he campaigned relentlessly. As the president led that commemoration in Chitambo, hundreds, if not thousands, gathered to celebrate in Lusaka, to celebrate his life. I called my father last night, and he could recall gathering in a stadium when he was just in primary school. They had dished out David Livingstone shirts, written David Livingstone, and the year of his birth and death. And there were these services held in stadiums, packed with people, to celebrate his life in 1974. Those of you who were alive, is there anyone here who was alive at the time? Very few. So that happened then. In fact, he encouraged me to go to the archives and get newspaper clippings because it certainly would have been recorded there. So let's get into his life, background, and formative years. David Livingstone was born in 1813 in Scotland. He was born with not very much at all. In fact, pretty much it would be it would probably be worse than the compounds, the kind of setting he was born. His father was a tea salesman who did not earn much. He earned so little that the children, David Livingstone and his 2 brothers, one immediately preceding and one after, were put to work while still kids in the local cotton threading making factory. So at just the age of 10, David Livingstone began to work there. Many children worked at the cotton mill along with adults. Children were advantageous because they had small fingers, they had small bodies, and so they could move around the machinery that was making the equipment, and their little fingers could reach the cotton and do all these things. And so David Livingstone started there at the age of 10. The schedule was extremely demanding. In fact, it basically robbed Livingstone and the children who worked there of a childhood. The day began at 6, in fact, 5:30. They had to be working before 6 a.m. If they were late, they risked losing their job. They worked until 8 p.m. Imagine, they reported at 6 a.m., knocked off at 20 hours in the evening. As soon as they knocked off, they went to school for another 2 hours. That takes us to what time? 22, eh? So the cotton mill decided to run a 2-hour school right after work for the children who were working. And so those children who had the stamina and the drive and ambition would stay on for those studies from 20 hours to 22 hours. So it was a 14-hour work day, 30 minutes for breakfast and about an hour for lunch. At 10 o'clock, he then went home, had supper, and studied for another 2 hours until midnight. He did this 6 days a week, Monday to Saturday, for 10 years. No childhood. David, however, was so committed to his studies that he would often go beyond midnight. And his mother, Agnes, would often have to come and confiscate his books and blow out the candle and tell him, hey, sleep, you need to be up early tomorrow for work. Their living conditions were very bad. The house was nothing more than a single room, just 3 by 4 meters. That's the room of my daughter. That's my daughter's bedroom. 3 meters by 4 meters. That was the house in which his 2 parents and he, along with his 4 siblings, lived. 3 boys, 2 girls. There were 2 demarcations for beds, and that was it. In that room, everything was done. Washing, cooking, reading, family time, reproduction. You understand what I'm saying? Everything was done there. No running water. Water had to be fetched from outside and carried upstairs. They were on a higher level. Communal toilets and bathrooms. They had to go outside to bath and use the bathroom. And these were communal. All those in the apartments would use the same toilets and bathrooms. David Livingstone lived in that cramped space until the age of 14, when he and his older brother moved to live with their grandparents. To compensate for such a difficult upbringing situation, David Livingstone had a rich Christian heritage. His father, Neil, a traveling tea salesman, was a committed Christian and saw himself as a missionary. Every door he knocked selling tea, monthly he would do around, through all the houses selling tea. He would leave tracts and he would have gospel conversations and evangelize to the people he encountered. For generations, the Livingstones lived by the motto of honesty. An older ancestor, an early ancestor of the Livingstones, on his deathbed gathered his children, the ancestors of Livingstone, and told them this: "Now in my lifetime, I have searched most carefully through all the traditions I could find of our family, and I never could discover that there was a dishonest man among our forefathers. If therefore any of you or any of your children should take up dishonest ways, it will not be because it runs in our blood. I leave this precept with you: be honest." And this was the defining, really, feature of David Livingstone's life: just faithfulness, honesty, fulfilling promises, especially to the Africans. It cost him dearly to fulfill the promises he made, but that's what God used in the end. David Livingstone wrote that his father was never rich, but Livingstone says, "My father deserved my lasting gratitude and homage for presenting me from infancy with a continuously consistent pious example. I revere his memory." David did not despise or become resentful at the hardships in which he grew. In fact, he said that if he could turn back time, he would not have it any other way. David had a hunger for reading and was very driven in his desire for education. With his first pay, the very first pay he got, he rushed off to buy a Latin grammar book and began learning Latin. He gave the rest of the money to his mother. What he would do is, of course, there was little time to read. he would put the book on the machines in the cotton mills, and he would read a line and move around, do whatever is, they were passing under machines and, passing their fingers in machines and pulling cotton and pushing cotton. So he would read a line, walk around, complete a task, come back, read another line, complete a task, come back, read another, and slowly he worked through many books. In fact, he read almost every book he could find. And his interests were broad. He just hated novels. By the way, he also hated theological books. He called it dry theology. So he had no interest in that. His father had to whip him because he didn't want to read a theological book that he had been given. With this kind of commitment to education, it's no surprise that David, having finished learning all the classical languages, was able to apply and be successfully picked to study medicine at Anderson's College, the medical wing of the University of Glasgow, at the age of 19. It was only towards the end of his time at the factory, before transitioning to working, that the parliament passed a law to better support children who were working under these hard conditions. So David Livingstone missed the benefit of the law that the government passed. And so he worked under those tough conditions, lived in those conditions without any aid or help from the government. He missed it when they had finally brought it in. I think that's important. I want us to discuss it in our group discussion after the second session. People who came from the cotton mill never went to college. In fact, they never even knew how to read or write. Very few children had the energy or stamina to remain after 20 hours to go and attend classes for 2 hours. Most of them were illiterate. For David Livingstone to have mastered the classical languages so that he could qualify for medical studies would have blown the minds of those at the university. David Livingstone had to raise his own money for his studies. So he had to save from the cotton mill the money he was making. Thankfully, got promoted about 18 or 19 and was making more money. But in the end, he would spend 6 months at school and 6 months back at the cotton mill working. And his bosses at the cotton mill, the owners of the cotton mill, said, look, choose. We can't do this half-half thing. If you leave to go and study again, your job is not guaranteed when you come back. But he did not compromise on his studies. At the Andersonian, David learned anatomy, surgery, materia medica, while finding time to still learn Greek and attend lectures on divinity or theology. He had become a Christian at the age of 19, so it took him quite a while. Remember, he didn't like theology. He would often come under conviction when he'd hear the gospel preached, but he would brush it off. He was anxious to make things right with God, but felt unworthy to be saved. He said, I found neither peace nor happiness, which caused me, never having revealed my state of mind to anyone, often to bewail my sad estate with tears in secret. He finally pleaded with the Lord to save him at age 19, greatly helped by reading the writings of a Scottish preacher. He wrote about his conversion. Great pains had been taken by my parents to instill the doctrines of Christianity into my mind, and I had no difficulty in understanding the theory of our free salvation by the atonement of our Savior. But it was only about this time, at age 19, that I really began to feel the necessity and value of a personal application of the provisions of that atonement to my own case. Livingstone read about Carl Gutzlaff, a missionary and doctor to China, who had written tracts encouraging Britons to go to China, which at the time was the most populous nation in the world of 400 million, with hardly any Christians. So Livingstone set his mind on China. But in the providence of God, China got into a war with Britain, which closed that door. And on a chance meeting in London with a missionary from Africa, Moffat, David Livingstone heard about the work in China. And Moffat told him, Moffat, who had set up a mission station in modern-day Botswana, which was the highest known point in Africa. Up above him was darkness. It was the Kalahari Desert that even the Africans would fail to cross. And so they just said, look, there's nothing there, there's no one there. And so that was the highest point at the time. And Moffat gave him this dream. And you know, David Livingstone, who had spent his entire childhood working with no time to play and be outside, was so enchanted to hear about Africa, where it's just bush and you're outside. And just the thought of being in the plains of Africa, exploring new areas, he just fell in love with the idea. Moffat told him about the smoke of 1,000 villages that rises at sunset in the distance, where no missionary has ever been. So David Livingstone wound up his studies. He graduated at the age of 26. He almost failed his exams, disagreeing with the examiner about the use of a stethoscope, but finally he was accepted. By the way, he had been offered a lucrative job as a teacher that he turned down. His heart was set on missions. He applied to the London Missionary Society, the LMS, a non-denominational institution that sent out missionaries to share the gospel around the world. They sent him a questionnaire to fill in, which he submitted. They never responded. Weeks or months later, his father had to write a letter to them to tell them about his self-driven ambition and work ethic to get himself to where he had reached. And it's only then that they responded. He was so committed to his studies, he had to travel on weekends. He went back to Blantyre, but his studies were in Glasgow, Scotland, 9 miles away. And he would go back home on weekends. He had a free ride on Mondays, but he decided to walk instead so that he would never miss his Monday class. That's how committed he was to his studies. Livingstone was a poor preacher. In fact, the London Missionary Society had given him to study under a pastor, to be trained in theology. And the pastor was not impressed at all. He gave David Livingstone assignments to go and preach. One time he went to preach, and you know, those days you were taught to preach without notes. So he stood in front of the congregation, read his text, and then he said, "Pardon me, I've forgotten what I wanted to say." And he walked out of the church and left for good. He wrote many times to people and said, "I'm a terrible preacher." He was nearly rejected by the LMS, the London Missionary Society, except that one of the directors pleaded for him to be given another chance. So they extended his period of study by 3 months, and only after that was he now sent out to Africa. Let me look quickly at Africa at the time of David Livingstone. That should be page 6, those of you with notes. Yeah. second half of page 6. So like I said, in the interior of Africa, white people had not been there. In one location that David Livingstone went to, in several locations, he was the first white man that they had ever seen. They would ask to touch his hair and ask to see his skin, and they were really curious about him. Large portions of people without land. Again, this was a very difficult place. The problem was that the interior of Africa was on a plateau. And that's why you have so many rivers, right, in the interior of Africa that have their source in the interior of Africa, and they flow down. The Nile, comes from the interior. Zambezi, obviously, from the interior to the coast, and so on. So it was on a plateau, and was infested with two things that made travel impossible: the mosquito and the tsetse fly. Mosquito killed you as a human being. The tsetse fly killed your animal, your horse or your oxen that pulled the carriage or that you rode on. And so it was just so difficult. To make matters worse, from the bottom was the Kalahari Desert, which even the blacks said you can't pass through this and survive. So there were large portions of land that you traveled without seeing anybody. In the interior of Africa, it was survival of the fittest. Livingstone wrote, in the colony and far beyond it, civilization has exerted a powerful influence. He's talking about the mission station. Men and women are ashamed to be seen in a state bordering upon nudity. But immediately beyond the mission, when you leave the mission station, so where the mission stations are, the Africans are civilized. You just travel a short distance away from the mission stations, a few hundred miles, and you see people living in a state of complete savagism. I have seen several specimens pass through this, and really they give me a much better idea of the pure heathenism that goes on. Bows, arrows, assegais, which in the hands of those under missionary influence look non-lethal, become terrible weapons in the wild. They were lazy. The people he encountered, the Africans, were lazy. One of the tribes he encountered as he began to venture from the mission north was the Bechuanas. And he helped them to build a canal of water that could bring water close to their dwelling. And they thought he was a miracle maker. Like, whoa, he's able to dig a hole and water comes, to us. He says, this, I believe, is the first instance in which Bechuanas have been gotten to work without wages. They only worked when you paid them. It was with the utmost difficulty the earlier missionaries got them to do anything. The missionaries solicited their permission to do what they did, and this was the very way to make them show off their airs. He says, they began now to understand that I am not to be imposed upon or abused. The other day, the chief came and begged something. I answered, Bubi, the name of the chief, you know I hate beggars. He disappeared in an instant. Some natives from a tribe about 100 miles south of this came on a visit while the dam was in progress and told the people that they ought to demand payment from me for the work. Next day, when they began to be tired, they told me what the strangers had said, adding that the missionaries at Kuruman, the mission station, always gave payment. So why aren't you giving us payment, Livingstone? I immediately left them. They followed me begging. and asked that I should not stop to show them how to work. And he told them that actually you are the ones who are supposed to be paying me, not me paying you. He says it was not helpful that the missionaries paid the Africans to work because it spoiled them and affected their mentality. Interior of Africa was also dangerous. The country was infested with lions, and the Africans exercised careful precautions when leaving the safety of the village, even in the daytime. Livingstone was wondering why they were so afraid of these lions and so on and so forth, until one day a woman was killed and eaten alive by a lion. And as he heard through the night her family and children wailing, is when it really hit him to say that these people, this place is actually dangerous. And these animals actually kill these people. Weaker tribes, stronger tribes dominated, attacked, killed. Stronger tribes dominated, attacked, killed weaker tribes. For their own safety, certain tribes lived further in the desert, and they would plant their gardens further away from where they were staying, just so that the stronger tribes would be discouraged from trying to access them, because they were so much in the desert. These tribes would eat locusts and wild honey to survive, because they were so far in that they were away from water. Spiritually, the Africans were largely of tender heart and conscience, easily convicted when preached to, but resistant to the gospel. This made me very sad to read. On one occasion, one of the chiefs, Sekomi, after sitting by the missionary in a hut for some time, deep in thought, at length addressed Livingstone and said, this is what he told Livingstone. You see, Livingstone every Sunday would stop traveling and would gather the people he found and preach to them every Sunday. And so in this way, he shared the gospel with the many tribes he was seeing. This is what the chief said. Livingstone, I wish you would change my heart. Give me medicine to change it. For it is proud and angry always. Livingstone raised the New Testament he was holding, intending to explain the only way in which the heart can be changed. But the chief cut him off by saying, nay, I wish to have it changed by medicine, to drink it and have it changed at once. For it is always very proud and very uneasy and continually angry with someone. The chief then rose and left the hut. It was not uncommon, especially at the mission station that he first landed at, when on Sunday when the preacher would be preaching, for the people gathered to come under such deep conviction that they would start sobbing and crying in the middle of the preaching. And they would walk off from the meeting before it was finished, wailing and crying, convicted about their sin. However, the reception to the message was almost zero. At Kuruman, the main mission station I talked about in Botswana, there were 350 to 400 people attending every Sunday, but only 40 who had committed to membership and been baptized. On top of that, the Boers, we know the Boers, the Dutch in South Africa, where ill-treated the Africans. In fact, everyone who came in ill-treated them. The Portuguese, who, by the way, were there in Angola, right, which is still Portuguese, Mozambique. So closed in were Portuguese from both sides. In fact, they were the big slave traders, the Portuguese. Then you had the Dutch from the bottom, from South Africa. And they also abused the Africans and killed them and sold them as slaves and kept them oppressed. And so David Livingstone oftentimes would have to shout, because once they just say, hey, a white guy is coming, they don't know if he's Dutch or Boer, but they're just threatened. And sometimes they would come out with spears ready to kill him. And at times, David Livingstone would remove his hat and wave it and say, no, I'm not Dutch, I'm not Portuguese. Sometimes he would wave his British flag and say, no, I'm not one of those guys. And sometimes, one time he even, because the Portuguese were slightly, were not as white as the English and British, those who lived in Africa, they were tanned because of the sun. One time he had to sort of open up his shirt, tear his shirt open before he was killed. He said, look, I'm white, I'm British. I'm not one of these people who you are afraid of. Once they got to know David Livingstone and how he conducted himself so differently, they even began to now despise him. One time when he was walking on a journey with two servants helping him on the journey, they didn't know that he had learnt the language and he could hear what they were saying. And this is what the two servants were gossiping about him in their language. He is not strong. He is quite slim. He only appears so short because he puts himself in those bags, meaning trousers. He will soon faint. And Livingstone says he was so offended at this that he made sure he walked non-stop, outwalked them until they were really panting and saying, actually, he's actually strong. We didn't realize how strong this guy actually was. Let's talk a little about his first missionary journey, and then we'll take a tea break. This is now page 8, I think. Might have moved around. On December 8th, 1840, Livingstone, aged 27, boarded the ship to South Africa, along with his fellow appointee, William Ross. And William Ross was with his newly wedded wife. They carried with them copies of the New Setswana New Testament that Robert Moffat had printed in London. Remember, Moffat is the one who told him, try Africa. I've set up a mission there, Kuruman. You can work from there and help there, and you can even explore further regions up north. Throughout the voyage to South Africa, Livingstone devoted his time to studying theology and two languages, Dutch and Setswana. He actually came up with a dictionary based on the Setswana Bible that had been printed. The most consequential thing on the trip was that he befriended the captain of the ship, who showed him how to use an instrument that allows you to calculate longitude and latitude. And in that way, actually using that instrument, Livingstone was able to map out the interior, because everywhere he stopped, he would record longitude, latitude. And it's the village here, these are the tribes here, and the next stop he would record. And he had so much data that he was able to just trace out. And even the rivers and lakes he found, he would mark them using longitude and latitude to see where they were located. In fact, later, when the Portuguese were telling the British that that interior of Africa was actually for them and they had mapped it out, the British said, give us the map. And the Portuguese submitted their map. They sent it to Livingstone in England. And they said, can you verify that this is accurate? And Livingstone said, no, wrong. And he corrected, because he knew just where everything was, because he had been mapping it out with the sextant, the device that calculated longitude and latitude. Livingstone, it was a 3-month journey from England to South Africa, another 10 weeks up to Kuruman, modern-day Botswana, where the mission was. Livingstone spent his initial time treating patients This is what he writes. I have patients now under treatment who have walked 130 miles for my advice. And when these go home, others will come for the same purpose. There's indigestion. These are the names which I don't know, which are the prevailing diseases. When in the interior, many bad cases were brought to me at every village, and sometimes my wagon was quite besieged by these blind and lame. The fact of my dealing in that medicine line, a little is so strange and new, my fame has spread far and wide. You see, nobody was doing this. Nobody was going into Africa as doctors to heal people, when doctors were golden and could make money in England and in Cape Town and in the developed areas. And so news spread. There's a white guy, an Englishman, and he's healing and helping us for free. Initially, the Botswana thought it inappropriate for Livingstone to assist with childbirths. But as he later related, a case of twins happening and the ointments of the doctors of the town proving utterly insufficient to effect the relief which a few seconds of English medical art afforded, the prejudice vanished at once. When they saw how he was able to help them deliver children far better and quicker than their own witch doctors, they said, "You are the man to now deliver all the babies." They even began coming to him for infertility issues. And Livingstone had to tell them, no. I'm just a doctor. I'm not a magician who can make you have children when you are unable. How are we doing with time? Okay, good. Let's end here and take, actually, let me just touch this quickly. Livingstone made 3 trips up north. Remember, he goes from Cape Town, actually Port Elizabeth, goes to Kuruman in Botswana. Then he made 3 treks up north. And his goal was to see where he could establish a new mission. He felt that the missionaries were all compact and busy in Kuruman when there was more work to be done up north. And so he made 3 treks, and it took him several weeks. He would be gone for 6 weeks, 2 months, 4 months on these treks. The first trip, he was invited by one of the missionaries he found at Kuruman, the mission station, Edwards. And they traveled with 2 Africans, and they were gone for 6 weeks. They traveled 700 miles, just moving around, visiting tribes, seeing what was up there. It's the furthest any had gone up until that time. The next 2 times, Edwards remained, and he went on his own with his African companions. He encountered many chiefs, and this was good for him to be away from the European missionaries, just to be, dipped into the culture and just with the people. And so his understanding of the language really just shot up, and his understanding of the culture and the people as well. They got to know him, he got to know them. On his second trip, he wrote to his sister Agnes the following: I was at this place interrupted by one of Bubi, that's the chief, Bubi's wives, bringing me some beans. I gave her a string of amber beads and 2 rings. In giving them, I called her sister, which pleased her so very much, she is determined to act as one. Every evening since, she sends me a huge bowl of sour porridge or beans or some sweet reeds with the message, "Sister sends you this," as she ought to take good care of her brother. On his third journey, this is a good place to end. he met a chief called Sesheli with his people. Livingstone described the scene of the great white throne, basically the judgment day, and God who would sit on it. In response to this teaching, Sesheli said, "You startle me, you scare me. These words make all my bones to shake. I have no more strength." Then the chief asked a difficult question. "But my forefathers were living at the same time yours were, and how is it that they did not send them word about these terrible things sooner? Why are we only hearing about judgment, the judgment of God now? Where were your forefathers to come and teach my forefathers?" All of them passed away into darkness without knowing where they were going. That's what the chief told Livingstone about his ancestors. Livingstone says, "I thought immediately of the guilt of the church, but did not confess. I told him multitudes in our own country were like himself, so much in love with their sins, as my ancestors had spent a great deal of time in trying to persuade them. And yet, after all, many of them, by refusing, were lost." He added, following his exchange with Sesheli, "I got out of the difficulty," the question he had asked, "by explaining the geographical barriers in the north of inland south of Africa and the gradual spread of knowledge from the south. Pointing to the vast Kalahari Desert, Sesheli responded, 'You never can cross that country to the tribes beyond. It is utterly impossible, even for us black men, except in certain seasons, when more than the usual supply of rain falls and an extraordinary growth of watermelons follows. Even we who know the country would certainly perish without them.'" His point was this: it's a good thing, you want to go and preach the gospel to the tribes up north, but you can't cross the Kalahari. The Kalahari is too difficult to cross. Even our own people fail to cross the Kalahari. And you could only do it in a small window outside of the heat of the sun to be able to cross through the desert and survive. Let's end the session there. Let's take a quick tea break, 10 minutes, then we'll come back for session